Hey everybody, this is Dream, and we've got a nice slate here for Wednesday's games. So overall, we have a pretty big slate. I think there's 12 games here. We have a really good opportunity for pitcher, especially today, just because there's a lot of more value options available than normal. We also have about 5 teams that are really stackable: Atlanta, Boston, Baltimore, the LA Angels, Trout and Otani, and Ward, and then the Washington Nationals. Other than that, you could argue a couple other little teams, at least from some positions, but overall, those are the best stackable teams today. From the pitching perspective, I actually have quite a few guys to take a look at here on FanDuel. So let's go ahead and get started here. So the first guy is Garrett Cole. He's obviously pretty expensive, but he's had 2 games under 26 fantasy points against Toronto this season. But he's been over 30 in all of his games recently, with the exception of 2 games since June 9th. So he has some upside here, but he's not the most ideal option, simply because the opponent has been good against him this season. And a lot of the guys in Toronto's starting lineup have a good career history against Cole as well. So just keep that in mind if you decide to, utilize him. Justin Verlander is the guy that he's been really inconsistent lately, but he tends to get enough Ks to keep to be pretty safe. His floor is in the mid 20s, and he has the upside of 40 or so. And this matchup is pretty decent for him. It's not the best, but it's not the worst either against Arizona. Let me fix this here. And then we're going to look at Brandon Woodruff from Milwaukee against St. Louis. Now, he has had 2 bad games against, 2 games under 27 against St. Louis this season. But he's had 3 straight games over 50 fantasy points, but it's not the most ideal situation for him. But he has been pitching pretty well as of late, so he's somebody to consider based on that. Then we're going to look at Aaron Nola for Philadelphia. And he's been very inconsistent lately, but he does have 50-point upside in this matchup against the Chicago Cubs. But he also has 5-point downside as well. He's very boomer bust. And then we're going to look at Julio Urias. Now he's probably the safest option on the board. He's very safe against San Diego this season. He's got 31, 40, and 36 fantasy points. There's probably going to be a couple pitchers that will score more points than him, but he also has been getting He's been getting a lot of quality starts and wins in almost all of his starts, and I think that's why he's I think he's second or third in the league in Major League Baseball and just total wins. So that gives us a bonus in fantasy points for him. He's probably my favorite play on FanDuel today, to be honest. Then we're going to take a look at Martin Perez. Martin Perez is playing is a little bit cheaper than everybody else I've already mentioned, but he's had 39, 40, and 37 fantasy points against Seattle this season, and he's had 7, 9, and 7 strikeouts in those games. Now, he hasn't been that good in a lot of the other teams, but for some reason he's just doing really good against them, so he's somebody to take a look at. And then we're going to look at Tajon Walker, who's $8,700. Now, normally he's not somebody I'd ever really consider rostering, but in his matchup against Miami, this season he scored 58, 46, 54, 36, and 26 against Miami this season. I mean, if he has any of those scores, then he's going to be somebody that's, the 20s are not ideal, but anything above 30 I'm pretty happy with, and he's had 4 out of 5 games over 34 fantasy points, including 3 over 46 against Miami. He's in an interesting spot simply because he has some upside in this particular matchup because of that. And then finally, Hayden Wisnowski. Now, he's only pitched 4 games, but as you can tell, he's had 3 games over 40, with the one exception of an 11-point game in the middle. He has been getting a decent amount of strikeouts too, which makes him kind of decent in this particular situation. Plus, Philadelphia hasn't been playing very well. He's not super ideal, but if you're just desperate to save money, Walker or Wisnowski is somebody to take a look at. So let's go ahead and move on to the batters that I like today. So Matt Olson is going to lead this spot here. His price is also pretty decent, and he's been pretty good the last 3 games after finally getting out of the slump that he was in. He took a day off a couple games ago, and that seems to really have got him back going. He's had a hit in every game since, including a home run the other day. Freddie Freeman's another guy I really like here. He's averaging almost 13 fantasy points a game, and he's been pretty solid lately. Now, this matchup isn't the most ideal for him against Musgrove, but he's still in a pretty good spot, and so I think he's somebody to take consideration. Now, if you want to take advantage of Michael Lorenzen, Seth Brown is one of the guys you could do it with. He's had some really big games. He is very boom or bust, though, so you'd have to be careful, but his price is pretty cheap. Pete Alonso has been hitting the ball pretty well, averaging 21 fantasy points a game for the last 10. He's absolutely just been crushing everything. He's had a home run in 3 straight games, and of course they're trying to get with the Braves. Obviously, his price has come way up, but he's almost very playable. He's still kind of playable because his price isn't as ridiculous as some others like Judge or Trout and stuff. So then we're going to look at Vlad Jr., who's averaging about 10 fantasy points a game, and he's been playing pretty well. This is a nice little plus matchup for him against a pitcher that he's mastered for a long time. Now, granted, Cole is a decent pitcher, so it could be the one day where he doesn't do well, but I still think he's in a pretty solid situation. Ryan Mountcastle is playing again for Baltimore against Boston. This series has produced a ton of runs, and he's done great in the last 6 or 7 games, so I really like him, plus his price point is really cheap. Then we're going to look at Rizzo for the Yankees against Mitch White, who always gets talked about being some decent pitcher, but I've never seen it. And this is a nice spot for Rizzo to have another big game. He is a little bit boom or bust, but he's in a good spot here. At second base, the top option is obviously Altuve, who's averaging 12 fantasy points a game, hitting the ball extremely well, having some massive games, and he's always somebody you have to take into consideration. Marcus Simeon's in a little bit of a tough matchup here against George Kirby, but he's been hitting the ball really well, and I think he's a good option here just because of the consistency that he's been able to maintain recently. Luis Urias has been extremely terrible lately, but he's in a really nice plus matchup here, and then you can see the last 2 games he's starting to get some hits again. It's not that he hasn't, his batting average has been good, but he's not getting RBIs and stuff, which is very important on DraftKings, or on FanDuel, and you can see that he hasn't really gotten many lately. And so that's really hurting his potential in fantasy. But his price also reflects that. Then we're going to look at Max Muncy for the Dodgers. Another guy against Musgrave who's been really good against Musgrave, but it's not an ideal matchup on paper. It just is based on his history against Musgrave. Then Tony Kemp is an option for Oakland. He's one of 3 options in Oakland that are pretty decent. Him, Seth Brown, and then you could also look at Sean Murphy, but I didn't include him on this simply because he's a little bit weaker than some of the others. But he, like Seth Brown, have been having some good games lately. But he's a little bit more boom or bust than Brown is. And then we're going to look at Rengifo for the Angels. He's just too cheap for the situation. And he's been boom or bust lately, but he's getting, if he gets a 7 or 8, 9-point game, we're not going to complain too much, and he's been hitting the ball pretty well, and it's a nice plus matchup for him. At third base, it's going to be hard to get me to not want to use Rafael Devers or Austin Riley, simply because they've both been hitting the ball pretty well, and they're pretty safe, despite the fact that they're pretty expensive. They're more expensive at this position than some of the other guys. Riley's been a little bit more boom or bust, but Atlanta's a nice little plus matchup here. Alex Bregman has not been hitting the ball quite as well up until the last few games. As you can see, he's been going on these little mini slumps and then mini booms. And so this is a matter of if you can get him in the right matchups. Suarez for Seattle. Suarez. He's averaging almost 15 fantasy points a game. He may or may not play, but he's extremely boom or bust, but he's having some really massive games lately. And then Yoan Moncada for Chicago. He's just been hitting the ball really well as of late, and he's got a nice, decent matchup here. And I really expect Chicago to start, to get back to doing as good as they were doing for a couple weeks. But granted, there are a ton of games left, so maybe they're just winding down. Xander Bogaerts is another guy I like here Now, he hasn't been good lately, but he's kind of due, and he's a good enough player that he can take care of subpar pitching in this matchup. Francisco Lindor is averaging almost 16 fantasy points a game, and he's had some really big games, so he's a little bit boomer bust. Trey Turner is not been good lately, but he finally had a decent game against St. Louis earlier, and it's just a matter of time before he starts hitting the ball well again, and this is a good situation for him to do so. Brandon Crawford is a guy I've liked this week against Colorado, simply because he's had a really good history against these particular guys, and it doesn't matter that it's not in Colorado. He gets, hits and walks and stuff like that, so he's been pretty solid as of late. In the outfield, we have Ohtani for the Angels, and his price is actually fairly decent for his potential production in this nice plus matchup that he has. I really think that you could run a Rengifo, Ohtani, Trout lineup if you really wanted to. As you can see, he's been pretty solid lately, getting hits in nearly every game. That brings us to Trout, who's obviously more expensive, but he also has real big boom potential. And after his little mini slump, he's back at it right now. And then we'll look at Ronald Acuna, who's a little bit expensive, but he finally hit a home run yesterday. And he had, or two, I should say, rather. He had 37 fantasy points. He'll look to continue that against Washington. And Judge is having a little bit of a rough time the last few games. Just hadn't hit the home runs. But he is still scoring fantasy points, with the exception of those 2 games against Boston. And so he's somebody you can consider. As long as he gets, 15 or so fantasy points, then he can pay off here. Jock Peterson's a guy that's in a pretty good spot, but he hasn't been hitting the ball very well lately. But he finally had a big game yesterday, and so I look for him to... And he's had a couple games here. He's just been very boom or bust, but his price is definitely interesting here. Kyle Tucker, he's obviously a home run threat when he comes up to bat, and he's had some really big games lately, but he's really boom and bust. The Mitch Haniger is a guy that seems pretty interesting today for Seattle. Against Martin Perez. He's just been extremely boom or bust lately, but if he can boom, then that will be a nice situation. Mike Yastrzemski is in a good spot here, and his price is pretty inexpensive, and he's been hitting the ball pretty well lately, and so I think that he's somebody you have to consider. Santander for Baltimore against Boston. He's had 3 40-plus fantasy point games in the last 4 games, with 6 home runs in those games. That's just insane. If he can come anywhere close to that, he'll be you'll like it. But he's extreme. He's like the most extreme boomer bust option available, because sometimes he does that, and sometimes he just goes 0 for 4. Rosario for Atlanta has been surprisingly starting to hit the ball pretty solid lately, and while he's not a huge home run threat, he can get hot and have some really big games. Austin Hayes for Baltimore has also been hitting the ball decently lately and has had some really solid games, especially in this series against Boston, where there are a lot of points or a lot of runs being scored. Mookie Betts is not hitting the ball well, but his price has come way down. And so if he can sneak a home run in this matchup, then this is a great situation to utilize him for. Then we got Michael Harris, who he's just been extremely good lately. I mean, he had 2-0 games, but outside of that, he's had good game after good game after good game, and he's a home run threat every time he comes to bat, especially against bad pitching. And then Taylor Ward for the Angels is in a good spot. He's been pretty solid lately. His price is still a little bit too cheap for his production. And then finally, Tommy Pham, his price is too cheap for what he's been doing lately. But he is a little bit boomer bust, so you just have to think about that. But he's still averaging almost 9 fantasy points a game. Overall, I think the slate is pretty solid. We have a lot of good teams on the slate. We got some good pitching. Pitching's going to be hard today, probably because there's so much value available. that's actually pretty decent. Most days I tend to just want to pay up for the best pitcher, but I might end up paying for Julio Urias or even Martin Perez just to see how it looks, when we get closer and get the official lineups. But overall, we have some really solid options today. So with that said, thank you guys again for liking, commenting, and subscribing. If you have any comments or questions, feel free to leave them below. And have a nice day, guys.